Good evening. I'm Janet Gornick, Professor of Political Science and Sociology at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. I'm also Director of the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality, the co-host of this evening's event. The Stone Center's mission is to build and share knowledge about the causes, nature, and consequences of socioeconomic inequality. I welcome you to this evening's event. Tonight's event is the second in a special online series produced by the Graduate Center titled Change. The series was catalyzed by the many societal transformations that we're all witnessing during this tumultuous year. Our hope is that the series will deepen ongoing conversations and will sharpen collective thinking about prospects for change. What is most needed, what is possible, what is worth fighting for, what pathways for change are most promising. Tonight, we focus our attention on the labor market and on places of work. We'll consider the interacting crises brought on by COVID-19 and assess strategies for creating more equitable workplaces. We dedicate tonight's event to the memory of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. During her 27 years on the Supreme Court, she was a tireless advocate for progressive labor market reforms and worker protections. Her blistering dissent in the Ledbetter versus Goodyear case is widely credited with leading to the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, legislation that made it easier for workers to win pay discrimination cases. We honor her astonishing legacy tonight as we turn our attention to workplace change. It's now my pleasure to introduce our four participants. I'm going to do that very briefly, mindful that I'm foregoing most of their accomplishments. Michelle Holder is Assistant Professor of Economics at John Jay College here at the City University of New York. Prior to joining John Jay, she worked as an economist in the nonprofit and government sectors. Her research focuses on the Black community and on women in the US labor market. Her book, African American Men and the Labor Market During the Great Recession, was published in 2017. Paul Krugman is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, distinguished professor of economics here at the Graduate Center, core faculty member in the Stone Center, New York Times columnist, and author of many books, most recently, Arguing with Zombies, Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future. Brigid Schulte is director of the Better Life Lab, the Work Family Justice and Gender Equity Program at New America, a nonpartisan think tank located in DC. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, formerly at the Washington Post, and author of the best-selling book, Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. And Felicia Wong, our moderator, is president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, a New York-based think tank and campus network. She's co-author of the 2017 book, The Hidden Rules of Race, Barriers to an Inclusive Economy. Her work, like that of all of this evening's panelists, has appeared in a wide array of media outlets. So welcome to our audience and welcome to the panelists. Felicia, I turn the event over to you.
Thanks so much, Janet. And thanks to the Graduate Center and the Stone Center for hosting this evening's conversation. So I think we'll get right into it. Let me just set the stage by saying the goal of our discussion tonight is to really help folks understand the answer to the question, just how hard is it to get a good job today? Who is it really hard for? What do the unemployment numbers that we see flying around every day, what do those numbers really mean? Is this about COVID, or is this about a set of conditions that existed before COVID? And most importantly, I think for all of us, is this something that we can do something about? Is the labor market something that we don't have an ability to structure and control and change? Or are there policies that we can really try to promote that would make life and jobs and work better for more Americans? So we're going to try to have a conversation that puts a story to the numbers. And then we're also going to try to do a little future casting. How much of the unemployment and business downturn right now is temporary? Is this long-term scarring? Can we build back better, as we hear in the presidential race? And what would that take? I'm going to ask questions to each of our panelists and then open it up with some conversation, questions for all of us. And at about 8:10, we'll start taking questions from the audience. You can go ahead and use your Q&A function to do that. At any time, we won't probably really start fielding them for about a half an hour. So let me start with Paul. Paul, help us understand unemployment in America right now. What are the number of people receiving unemployment benefits? What about people who are underemployed? What does the unemployment rate actually mean as compared to the quote labor force participation rate? What do all these numbers really mean for real people?
Okay. Yeah, that's always been a question, right? Unemployment, the official unemployment rate, there are actually 6 different official unemployment rates. And the one you always hear cited is U3, which is basically, have you been looking for a job in the past month and been unable to find one? But that's, everybody who is serious knows that that's an indicator. It's not an actual measure of how many people are frustrated. The number of people who are unable to find a job, but haven't been actively looking because they're not trying, who are underemployed, is almost certainly much larger. And we have U6 is closer to that, even that. And all of these things are really screwed up by the pandemic. People are, what is somebody who's been, is on layoff but expects to be back at the job when this thing is over? That person should be counted as unemployed, but may not be. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics have been quite frank, saying that we're having some trouble with measurement here. But I think the way to say this is that, look, before the pandemic, early this year, we were finally starting to look like we might be kind of at full employment. And never mind what the official unemployment number was very low, but other ways, until really just a few months before the pandemic, a lot of other indicators suggest that there were still substantial numbers of people who were being frustrated.
Can you even tell us what full employment means? Does that mean every single adult in America is working, or people who want jobs and get jobs?
There's always churn, right? We have a vast and dynamic economy, and in good times, 1.5 million people are laid off every month, right? There's always vast churn, and so there are always people between jobs, people entering the. So full employment isn't a zero unemployment rate. There will always be some people who are looking for work but haven't yet found a job, or haven't yet found one that they're willing to take, and that's okay. But it's kind of when people feel that jobs are easy to get, and but not where we have a situation where employers are desperate because they can't find workers. So full employment is when we'd like to imagine that we can actually pin down a number, and we don't really know where it is exactly, but we know that at this point is clearly it's a measured unemployment rate under 4% is full employment. And we were kind of there. There were a lot of questions about the quality of jobs, but I think the thing to say is that even before this, it was fragile. It was obvious that we were kind of at full employment, but only thanks to extremely low interest rates, large budget deficits, that we were not prepared, that basically we had no shock absorbers, that if we hit any kind of bump in the road, something would, we were ill prepared to deal with it. And then, of course, we hit the mother of all bumps in the road in the form of the coronavirus, which, now the funny thing was that I actually think that our initial response was a success. 22 million people lost their jobs, but that was almost all of those were jobs that we actually needed people to stop doing because they were high virus.
And when you say our initial response, you mean the CARES Act earlier this spring, the federal legislation.
I talk about the miracle of March. Faced with a crisis, incredibly, we responded with adequate policies. They weren't perfect, a lot of wasted money, but incredibly, we actually responded with enough money. It ran into all kinds of problems with overloaded unemployment agencies and so on. But still, on the whole, grading on a curve, grading given U.S. history on these things, we did pretty well. We provided huge supplemental benefits. We helped businesses, though that program didn't work very well, but we did enough to avoid. We only lost mostly the jobs that we needed to actually shut down temporarily because of the pandemic. And it was a miracle that the policy was that good. And it was also kind of an accident. I mean, the way I think about it is that Democrats, Ron Wyden had an unemployment benefits plan. He'd actually been thinking about the issue. Democrats passed it. Republicans were caught so flat-footed by the whole situation. There's the old joke from the TV show, Yes, Prime Minister. We must do something. This is something, therefore we must do it. That's kind of what happened in terms of the policy. We accidentally stumbled into a really good policy. The trouble was that we did it only, it was all premised on the notion that this was going to be a relatively short-lived phenomenon. And so the expanded unemployment benefits turned into a pumpkin on July 31st. State and local government aid never materialized. So now we're in a situation where we're back where I feared we'd be, which is that we hit a bump in the road and we were not prepared for it. And now it becomes really scary that we will, reasonable estimates suggest that unless we have a big fiscal package, we're going to be seeing a whole secondary slump in the economy. The first one was kind of a necessary temporary shutdown because of the pandemic, but now we're faced with the real prospect of a gratuitous slump because we failed to act. So this story is not over yet, and the first act was miraculously better policy than I would have expected. The second act was policy that is unfortunately as bad as one might have expected, and this could be really pretty ugly in the months ahead.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that we essentially did a decent job of putting the economy sort of in the freezer, as it were.
Yeah.
But all of the fiscal policy relief is running out. There looks to be almost nothing behind this that will actually improve unemployment, et cetera. And so we're really in for a terrible road ahead unless something drastic changes. And I'd like to turn to Michelle now to ask you, as you think about this unemployment crisis, this employment crisis, much of your work focuses on Black women in the labor market. You study what you call a double gap faced by Black women who face discrimination and or labor market exclusions, both because of their race and because of their gender. So help our audience understand that a little bit. And then also, it would be great if you could speak a little bit about the newer movement that we're hearing something about, Black Women Best, or this idea that centering Black women as we measure and understand the economy is good not just for Black women, but for all Americans. So talk a little bit about all those things.
Wow, short list, Felicia, but I'll try. So thank you. I am Michelle Holder. I teach at the John Jay College, which is also part of the City University of New York system in the economics department. And may I just add, Janet Gornick opened our webinar in remembrance of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I did want to also acknowledge Breonna Taylor and Black Lives Matter. The rulings did come down today in terms of her death. And as a Black woman, I share grief with other Black women in the Black community writ large in this country. But this is not about our social problems. This is about our economic problems. And so just in terms of Black women, we talk about, or I talk about, right, and a lot of economists talk about the position of Black women in the American workforce and women in general, right, but women of color in particular. And so one of the things I like to remind people about, because, a lot of the question is, well, why are Black women and women of color kind of, obviously crowded in low wage occupations? Why were they sort of the hardest hit in the earlier part of the pandemic in terms of job losses? And so one of the things I like to remind folks about is, prior to the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the main occupation for Black women was as domestics. Fully over a third of Black women worked as domestics. Now, obviously one can imagine that Black women prior to 1964 in this country, and certainly after slavery ended, possessed a whole host of skills, but the labor market was not really open to them. And so it did open more after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, but in the following way: Black women who were, who primarily once worked as maids and that sort of thing, then moved into clerical work. And also this was occurring at a time during the second wave of the feminist movement when a lot of white married women, right, were entering the labor market. And that group sort of, writ large also entered as low wage clerical workers. So why I'm laying that foundation is to help us understand that when the labor market started absorbing lots of married white women, and when there was a shift in the employment of Black women in the USA, these groups ended up in low wage service occupations. And so this was only a generation or so ago, right, 50 years. So that kind of sets up the contours of where Black women and women in general would sort of end up in the American workforce. And so, Felicia, when you use the term double gap, what I mean by that is I primarily use it in terms of the wages that Black women make. So if we looked at sort of compensation levels by race and gender groups, the lowest on the pecking order would be Black women and Latinas. And so an implication of that is during a time where families need to rely on resources that they have, because Black women are underpaid and undercompensated writ large. This is not just a singular problem for, this is a well-studied area. These are fewer resources that the Black community has to rely on when in fact a cyclical downturn happens. And so the fact that, my wage trajectory and someone, with the same skill set, same education, same work experience, but not my gender, not my race, would have a higher wage trajectory simply means I have fewer resources to tap into for my family when things happen. And in an advanced capitalist country, things happen.
Has the pandemic made that you've described a structure, a setup in the labor market that puts Black women and other women of color at a significant disadvantage?
Yeah.
How has the pandemic made this worse?
So as an example, I took a look with a couple of other researchers, economists, and I'm going to circle back to Black Women Best. And we looked at the losses, the job losses to Black women during the early part of the pandemic in the US. And, unsurprisingly, the two occupations with the most jobs lost for Black women were as childcare workers and cashiers. Now, you might think that an essential worker like a childcare worker would be relatively insulated, but given the kind of inorganic nature within which industries were targeted for closure, we see that women, and Black women in particular, and Latinas as well, had this hyper exposure to job loss. And so I think what this pandemic has kind of lifted the veil on is that women of color occupy the least favorable position in the American workforce. And there are things that we can do about it. And one of the things that you mentioned, the term Black Women Best, that is a term that was coined by Janelle Jones at an organization called the Groundwork Collaborative in Washington, D.C. And what she means by that is if we build policies that center the least favored, the most disenfranchised, which would be Black women and other women of color, if we center that group, the policies that we create will benefit everyone, because if it benefits the least of these, it should benefit us all. And so that's what that terminology means.
Thank you. I have been interested to see that Janelle and Jared Bernstein have written about this, and some of these ideas about measuring employment by race and by gender have actually made their way into Joe Biden's presidential campaign pledges. So, ideas created by our friends, the people on this panel, can actually sometimes make it into positions of power, which is great. Brigid, I want to turn to you now. You are a writer, a journalist, a researcher. You have spoken to workers on the ground, especially but not exclusively women, about work in American life. You've done this for a very long time, and you focus on the question of balance, and you focus on the question of how we try to, we, the collective we, try to meet our parenting obligations, our professional obligations, and to find some time to, frankly, be human, right? So how do you think that this struggle to balance and to do what we want to do and what we need to do in various parts of our lives, how has that changed since COVID? I can think of the stories that my friends and I tell each other. I'm sure you have a lot of stories about how American parents are faring in the workplace and as family members.
Yeah, and it's not just parents. I think it's it's really important to point out that even before COVID, I don't really like to use the word balance because I call it a body lotion term. It just seems like bubble bath and sort of silly and not important. And yet the ability to combine meaningful work and time for care, connection, for other spheres in your life, the sort of the three great arenas of life, work and love and play. Before COVID hit, that was almost impossible for most people unless you were in the, in the very high upper echelons of American society. We were talking earlier about full employment. A lot of the work that we do looks at care and care work and caregivers. And just as Michelle was talking about, we're in the middle of a childcare crisis. And for the life of me, I don't understand why people aren't out in the streets protesting and why there isn't more outrage. But the fact that so many childcare centers are closed and that many of them say that they will probably never reopen, that we did have, sort of the March miracle that Paul had talked about. And yet the childcare bailout was $3 billion. Delta Airlines got more than that. There's been calls for more investment. Advocates are calling for $50 billion. The House passed it. It hasn't gotten anywhere. So when you look at, just sort of how the labor market was structured and who was doing what, even before COVID, care workers were earning poverty wages. Many of them do not have benefits, no retirement, no paid sick days, no paid family leave. We are one of the few advanced economies without these kinds of national guarantees that other countries would just see as sort of a basic human or worker right. So we already made it very difficult for workers to combine work and care. And then COVID has just pushed people, frankly, over the edge. You want to talk about inequality. Here I am, I have been able to work in my home office as a remote worker. I am one of the privileged ones. And what this pandemic has really shown is that telework is a marker of class. And we have come to really rely on the people who earn the poverty wages. We call them essential workers. We call them heroes. And yet, again, going back to the CARES Act, some of the emergency paid family leave or emergency paid sick days legislation that passed in March. On the one hand, it was an enormous jump for the United States. There'd been so much disagreement about it. So that we had something is something that's worth marking. On the other hand, the exemptions are so enormous as to make them almost a joke. For paid sick days, if you worked for an employer of more than 500 people, you were exempted. Well, who are those people? Walmart, Target workers, Amazon warehouse workers, all the people that we rely on as essential workers who were then, unless the company decided to give you a policy, they had to make this really horrific choice between going to work and earning money or staying home and keeping themselves safe. I've been running a weekly live podcast where we have a lot of worker voices, a lot of parent voices, men and women, people across the gender spectrum. And I'll never forget, we did an episode on paid sick days and we had a woman who is a home health worker. She's in her 70s. She's making like, $9 or $10 an hour, really dedicated. She's the breadwinner for her extended family. And she just said, if I get sick, I can't go to work. And then that means that I won't get paid. I will get nothing because there is no, national guarantee for paid sick days. And she said, it just makes you feel like people don't care about you. So I would say that before COVID, there were already huge problems and inequalities with the labor market. As we were talking about, retail workers, other essential workers who've been really hard hit. It's really only been in recent years, I would say in the last year or two, that people have come to realize that So many of these workers have unpredictable schedules, unpredictable hours. They get their schedules a day or two before they have to go to work. That is just no way to live. You can't arrange for childcare. You can't figure out when you go to the doctor. So we already had, work systems that simply were not working for so many workers, really exacerbating inequality. And I would say that COVID has shown a very harsh and very bright light on that. And I think we did have some of a response. We do have a paid family leave bill that passed in March, as Paul mentioned, but it expires at December 1st. It was only available to people with school-aged children. So if you needed to care for your aging parent who might have had COVID, you did not get any paid sick days. If you had just had a new child, you did not get any paid parental leave. So, these are conversations that we really need to be having in COVID, in sort of the immediate crisis, but also as we think about, what is it that we need to be creating for a more equitable and fairer labor market in the future.
Great. Thanks. So now I'd like to turn it to kind of a slightly broader conversation. I'll ask a couple of questions, and I think that all of you will have very interesting answers to the questions. So I want to talk about the idea of a job market, or even the idea of the economy. A lot of times, and I think this is probably true for many of the people who joined us this evening, you sort of think about the job market as something you can't do anything about. It's kind of like the weather. As an individual, you experience it, but there's nothing that you're just a taker. There's nothing you can actually do to influence that. But I suspect that all of you, in fact, I know from what you've all just said, that none of you really agree that nothing can be done to, quote, shape the labor market. You all think that there are things that we can do to make sure that Americans get better jobs, and that those jobs are better for all of us with respect to wages or time or voice on the job or agency or any of these things. So I'd like to ask all of you just to name one or two things that you think that we could do to make jobs better, either individual jobs or jobs across the sectors of our economy. And since, Paul, I started with you, I'm going to come back to you to ask you to take that question.
All right. So let me try to and we're all coming from very, very different backgrounds, and mine is probably the least human being centric of them. All of this economics and all of these impersonal statistics. But if I had to say, the thing that has been the biggest development in labor economics over the past generation has been that we've learned that your idea that labor market outcomes are determined by the invisible hand, that there are these impersonal forces and meddle with the gods of free markets and terrible things will happen to you, is wrong. We've learned that there is zero evidence that increases in the minimum wage lead to any significant reduction in employment, at least within the range we've seen in the US. We've learned that collective bargaining has huge impacts. Basically, the decline of unions is a very big part of the rise in inequality in the United States. And we see that there are societies where it's not so much we get hung up, I think, still in the notion that good jobs have to be the jobs that were good once upon a time, that assembly line workers in manufacturing plants are going to be the only thing that works. But it is possible to have much better pay for the jobs that exist, jobs that do very often involve one form or another of personal care, social health care, retail. We see other countries that have much stronger bargaining power for workers because of institutional differences, because they've basically empowered workers more than we have, and the Nordic countries being the obvious example, and they don't seem to pay any price for it in terms of lower employment, reduced GDP. So I think that's the answer. Basically, there's an awful lot of power relations in the labor market. It's not this invisible hand beyond control. And what we need to do, and a bunch of other things I would like to talk about if we come to them. But first and foremost, if we want to make a more equal outcome and a better life for ordinary workers, it's about changing those power relations so that workers have more power in the bargaining sphere.
Thanks. It's a great answer. Michelle, what would you do? What can we do?
Yeah, I'm going to pivot off of what Paul said about a pay, because, really, if you ask most workers what could be done to improve their situation, it's usually, right, can you pay me more? And certainly when it comes to women in general, and women of color in particular, Black women included, right, we do know there's a gender wage gap. And also with regard to the term, the double gap, Felicia, that you mentioned, I use that term in terms with regard to the undercompensation of Black women based on not just their gender, but also their race. Lots of studies show this, that there's not only a penalty with regard to your gender in the American workforce, but there's also one with regard to your race or your ethnicity. So I would say that if there's one thing that I think would be important, it would be, and this is something that a woman by the name of Jocelyn Fry, who works for the Center for American Progress, she's done a lot of work on this. That is really surrounding pay equity. And one thing that was done that was actually rolled back by the current administration was a revision to the EEO form, the Equal Opportunity Form, that all employers are federally mandated to complete, which provides information on race, gender, and occupation, right? So this helps detect instances of workplace discrimination. And there was a revision that was enacted under President Obama in 2016, which also required compensation data. So not only would we get all kinds of demographic information about the workers in a company, but we'd also get pay information. And I think that if we can revisit that change has been jettisoned by the current administration. If we can revisit that in terms of trying to move the needle on this pay equity issue with regard to women writ large and Black women and Latinas in particular, that would go a long way. And might I just add, because I was pressured to say this, if you like what you're hearing, check out John Jay's master's program in economics. Thank you.
That's a good plug. I like that plug. Brigid, name a few things that you think we should be doing to shape jobs in the labor market.
Yeah, I think that, like you say, people think that this is the weather. We just get so caught up in status quo thinking. And what we forget is that these, where we are is the result of choices that we have made, and we can make other choices. And so some of the choices are paid family and medical leave, universal national policy, paid sick days, universal national policy, no questions. It's just a basic. You can talk about making sure that healthcare is available to all workers, schedule control, which is what I'd like to say rather than flexibility. Sort of flexibility sort of implies kind of a white collar setting, and what you really need in a retail or hourly setting is control and say over your time, which you could translate into control and say over your time as well. In a white collar setting. Some countries have a right to request flexible work or more, schedule control, if you will. There's lots of good evidence that actually makes things better. More productivity, higher sales, more loyalty, happier, healthier workers. It's like there's really nothing wrong with happy, healthy workers. There's lots of research that shows that when you center on worker health and well-being, and you define well-being as creating space for care and connection, you actually do better. So I think that we need to be
your bottom line. You're sort of hiring as if you're a hiring manager, you will do better.
Well, there's all sorts of different kind of markers that you could look at. A couple other things that I would do. We've been talking an awful lot this summer about racial justice and structural racism, and we absolutely need to confront that head on. We've got incredibly horrific structural racism, and that is also, I think we also need to have a reckoning that is part of why we have such a crummy safety net. That is part of why we do not have universal family supportive policies. We need to confront that head on and move beyond that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of times people now in companies, they define that as diversity of thought, which is why you then can defend having, a board of all white men because one's an accountant, one's a lawyer. So that's diversity. I think we need to have different conversations about that, different markers. California has, they've passed legislation, sort of affirmative action around women and diversity on boards. There are certainly remedies like that. Other countries have done that. I think there's an awful lot that we could do.
Right. Thanks. So I want to now turn to thinking about different sectors of the economy. I'd be curious from all of you, are there some sectors of the economy that you think ought to shrink? Are there some sectors that you think ought to grow or be supported or be created or be supported better? And in particular, I'm thinking about some of the ideas we've seen lately on the campaign trail, especially from the Biden team. You saw Joe Biden earlier this summer say that a federal investment could create 10 million climate jobs through, investing in clean energy. He talks a lot. He's not the only one, but many people, he currently has a kind of bully pulpit, as it were, but he talks a lot about higher paying care jobs. He's talked about universal pre-K, so this is not an advertisement for any one or another political candidate, but we are hearing in the mainstream now these ideas that you could have a kind of federal investment and you could create better jobs in different kinds of sectors. I'd love to know what you all think about that. And again, I'm gonna go to Paul first. And Paul, also, you said there's other stuff you want to talk about, so go ahead and sneak that in.
So I just want to quickly say that one of the peculiar things about where we are right now is that the people who think that they're being hard-headed and sensible and it's all monetary incentives and that's all that matters are actually the people who are most out of touch with the reality. So we've had this constant drumbeat of complaints that unemployment benefits are discouraging workers from taking jobs. And there's zero evidence that that's taking place. And meanwhile, if you look at the Federal Reserve has something, the Federal Reserve actually, it's interesting, they don't believe in necessarily that statistics capture the whole thing. So the Fed routinely, they put out something called the Beige Book, which is they basically go out and talk to a lot of people and say, what are the stories you're hearing? Now, they talk to business people, not single mothers, but it's still. And when they talked about the obstacles to employment, they kind of almost grudgingly said, well, there may be some people being affected by unemployment benefits, but they put way ahead of that childcare, concerns about childcare and concerns about education. So it turns out that these issues about life and how do you manage and who's going to take care of the kids and if the schools aren't open, if the childcare, this is actually the hard economics of it is this stuff as well. It's not vague touchy-feely stuff. That's actually the stuff that matters, and all of this seemingly hard-headed monetary stuff is missing the point of what's actually mattering for Americans right now. In terms of so the case for a huge very large-scale public investment is overwhelming. For one thing, we've been neglecting infrastructure. We've been neglecting investment, and that should include investment in people as well. Children are human investment. Our colleague Branko Milanovic at the Stone Center makes fun of people who talk about human capital. I think that's a good point. But investing in the future, and interest rates are incredibly low. The federal government can borrow. Basically, adjusted for inflation, investors are paying the federal government to take their money and do something with it. So this is now, in terms of whether that will create lots of good jobs, I'm not sure that in itself does it. I think the main thing to say is that the composition of jobs, the future economy is going to be very much one that's centered on one way or another caring for people. It's if you look at the fastest growing occupations, most of them are basically some variant of nursing or social support. And the thing to do is not to say, well, how can we have different jobs, but instead to say, these are the jobs that we need to have done. How do we make sure that people who are doing those jobs are paid adequately, have the assurance, have health care coverage, have some security against shocks like the pandemic. So that I'm fine. We certainly have lots of room. I mean, if I'm a Green New Deal person, and people ask, what does that mean? And the answer is, well, I'm not quite sure, but that's an advantage. There's a whole bunch of stuff we need to do, and so one of the things it will do is it will create jobs. It will also help save the planet. It will also help keep the economy from lapsing into another depression. So let's go for it.
Yes, not being quite sure what a Green New Deal or a New Deal is quite Rooseveltian, actually, Paul.
Exactly. That's
and
right.
he pretty well. So Brigid, I want to turn to you now since you had the big thumbs up, and then I'll come back to you, Michelle, on these questions of like actually investing in different sectors across the economy. And while we have this conversation, I just want to remind the audience that we are here to take your Q&A. Please use the little Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom, and we'll have some time for questions after this round. But Brigid.
Yeah, no, I think that Paul hit it right on the head. You know, when you look at the future of work, you know, one of the things that I often say, and I think people maybe finally are starting to listen to us, is that the future of work is the future of care, because those are jobs that cannot be automated. You cannot, you know, maybe in Japan you can have robots taking care of your parents, but in the United States we're not quite there yet. You know, and so the question is, how do you make this decent and dignified work? And the good thing about it is that we've got some models. One of the podcast episodes that we did featured home health workers in Washington State. And there is a really interesting labor management and sort of political collaboration, SEIU 775. And what they've done is they're working together. There's worker power and worker voice. People are sitting down together. And so these jobs are good paying jobs. There's retirement. They have health insurance. There's professional training that they get. You know, and I was talking to one health worker, you know, a home health worker, you know, this is a really good job. And a lot of people who do care work are passionate about it and they love it. And now she's able to live. And meanwhile, her mother is also a home health worker in Arkansas. And she makes like $11 an hour with absolutely no benefits. And so I guess the thing is, we have models. It can be done. So that's what I would really like to see, is this necessary and important work that has been invisible and undervalued for so long. Bring it into the surface, you know, make it visible, value it, make it decent, dignified work.
Sounds great. Michelle, I'm assuming you'd like to add to some of this. These are all great ideas.
Yeah, I know we're short on time, so I'll just make it quick. This is one of the few panels I've been on where where the panelists agree on one specific thing, which is childcare. One of the cleavages exposed by this pandemic is how central childcare is to workers, right? Because aside from educating our children, schools were also a safe place for our children to be during the day. They were fed, they were looked after, and they were educated. And so I think, just to kind of marry Brigid's comments to Paul's comments, you know, if I believe that the childcare work is one area where government involvement could be helpful, right? Because childcare is really actually unaffordable for most working class families, while at the same time, childcare workers are not paid a living wage. These are considered low wage jobs. So if there's, you know, if we want to talk about public investment kind of helping us during this period in right now, it would be investment in childcare.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to some questions now from the audience. Why don't I actually put a couple together and then see if we can take them as a group. The first is, what about the effect of the pandemic on working parents, mothers in particular, many of whom are leaving their careers to guide their kids through online school? Could the pandemic imperil the careers of a generation of women? That's one question. And the second question, which is maybe not 100% related, but I want to give us a couple choices here. What role can evaluation and research have in workforce development, both during and post-COVID? So two different kinds of questions, one about the effect of the pandemic on working parents, and one about whether we need more evaluation and research in trying to understand policy development.
Well, I can take on the working parent one. I would leave policy development, to the experts. But I think that, we don't have a lot of really good data yet. We do have a number of surveys that do seem to indicate that women are bearing the brunt of the care work responsibilities, that women tend to be the ones who are doing more homeschooling. They are bearing more of the brunt of caregiving, which is not unusual because even before the pandemic, even when women were working full time, women tend to do about twice the amount of time. They spend twice about the amount of time than men in caregiving and house related sort of unpaid labor. Men's time has been increasing, but it's still there's a huge gap between what men and women do. And a lot of that is our work systems that still are kind of breadwinner, homemaker kind of systems that tend to reward that kind of structure, making it very difficult for men to be more active in terms of care and caregiving. That said, there are some indications, and there have been op-eds written that this could set women back a generation. And I think that we do need to pay attention to that. But that said, I will also say that there is some interesting and somewhat counterintuitive data that shows that there are certain couples that even though men are still not doing as much as women, they are doing more than they were before COVID. And I've certainly interviewed a number of men who are far more involved than they ever imagined that they would be. So I think we also need to see how that's going to shake out, how that could actually change men's roles as well. Because I think that even though we might have some calcified gender, kind of traditional gender norms that still are in play, I think what's really clear is that most families really rely on a woman's income, or there's so many single mothers out there. Paula was going to say, like, maybe the Fed needs to talk to single mothers and not just business leaders. Maybe they'd be able to make better decisions. So I think that what's happening with parents, what's happening with gender equality at home is something we all need to pay a lot of attention to. There's sort of a fatigue, if you will, among businesses that does give me a lot of concern. Like you saw a couple weeks ago, one university saying, "Okay, we're sick of you taking care of your kids at home. Come on back to work," or as if like what, your children were just going to evaporate and disappear. So there's a lot of conversation and movement that needs to happen on how we expect families to combine work and care, because we've put families in a really impossible situation.
Well, Brigid, you actually touched on that second. You started to go towards that second question about research and evaluation when you suggested that the Fed should talk to single moms. So, Michelle and Paul, I'd like to turn this to you to say either what data or research do you wish we had more of to think about shaping the labor market, better jobs for better people? Or are you concerned about a kind of long-term scarring effect for parents who are trying to do just too much during this pandemic?
Well,
Paul, do you want to go first? Or shall I?
sure. So let me just say first on the scarring issue. I think this is not like anything we've seen before, but we do know that disconnection from the labor market has very, very long-term effects. And I think it's actually, there would be two issues here. One is women, or just generally parents, but especially women who are not able to fully participate because of childcare, and the children themselves who are, are not getting the kind of education that they should be getting. And we know from evidence of college graduates who graduate into a bad labor market. The question is how long does it take to them to recover from the adverse impacts of that bad timing? And the answer is forever. They never recover. It's a permanent impact on their earnings. So this is serious. I kind of lost the thread there, what the second piece was, but yeah, maybe I should just leave it there and we'll come back to it.
Great. Michelle, is there anything you wanted to say about on the research question in
Oh,
particular?
that's what, I'll come back on that in a second.
Oh, okay. Michelle on research, then Paul on research. And then I've got another question lined up, which is not going to be pretty. So, but Michelle, research.
Sure. Well, actually, if you don't mind, Felicia, I did want to add that fully 1/3 of women working in America are mothers. And so I'm not sure what the comparable figure is for men, but certainly that speaks to the centrality and the need for, adequate childcare and a proper education for our children. And so I think we just need to bear in mind when, we're talking about getting out of this pandemic, the things that this pandemic kind of lifted the veil off of are the things that we should, pay most attention to as we are getting this pandemic under control. I know that wasn't what you asked, Felicia, but I just wanted to add that in there.
Totally fine. Paul, the research question.
No, so of course, we always want more research and we want more study. And there's a lot of these things that are understudied. But I think actually I teach a course at the grad center on welfare states. And the fact of the matter is that although there's lots of things we don't know, there's enough variation. There's lots of things that we do know work. I mean, the question of how can you have a national child care policy that makes it possible for parents to work and be assured? Countries do that. So I don't think we should say that taking active policy steps needs to wait on more research. Of course, we always want to be studying more, but the fact of the matter is that what we do, there's lots of known ways to make things better that we're just not doing. So that should not be a constraint on our moving quickly to do a lot to make American life better.
Great, thanks. Okay, so now the not so pretty question. We've gotten a couple of these. They're all variations on the same theme, but it's basically those in power, those currently in power, seem to have no interest in moving in ways that could lift all boats. How will you address all of this if a Trump victory yields a kind of nightmare such that what we are seeing now becomes irreparably deeper? A related question was, how do you move any of these ideas when you hear Republicans call them socialist in ways that are intended to render any of these ideas completely politically untouchable? So how do you deal with some of this in the current political situation, I guess is really the question.
Just to say, I don't, if there's a Trump victory, I think issues of childcare and work and those are actually all going to be secondary. We're going to be dealing with much more existential questions. So I don't think anyone's going to care about what we have to say about these issues in the event of a Trump victory. And so it's really the policy analysis here all has to be, what do we do assuming that we have decent people at the top, and which is by no means guaranteed, but assuming that's and then I will say that I believe that the socialist smear, everything is socialist, has much less political effectiveness than people imagine. It really just and there have been some studies now that show that actually that congressional staff have their views of what their constituents' views are all wrong. That people in Congress believe that their constituents are much more conservative on economic and social policy than they really are. And so what you just need is a little, money will count, interest will count, revolving door. There's always going to be a problem, but I think there's much more scope politically for a serious progressive agenda than most people have been willing to acknowledge until very recently.
Certainly the polls suggest that is true. But, for Brigid or for Michelle, do you see any opportunity, even if you see conservatism and or anti-work leaders or anti-worker leaders at the they wouldn't call themselves that, but at the federal level. Do you see opportunities at the state level? Brigid, you talked about, the contrast in, home healthcare workers in Arkansas versus Washington State. So are there opportunities at the state level, or are there other things? I sometimes hear people talking about corporate companies voluntarily doing better things for their employees. Do you see any hope there? So just a question to try to move us off an exclusively federal policy kind of platform.
Well, certainly, when you look at, say, for instance, paid family leave, we don't have a national policy, but we've got this growing movement at the state level, so that there is always, in childcare in many other countries, it is more of a state and local issue. So you are seeing some innovation at the state and local level. So I think that is something to be thinking about. And to Paul's point, if there is another Trump administration, and then on the policy level, issues like childcare and work and family justice kinds of issues, I no doubt would take a back seat. And yet they are front and center for the lived experience of American voters, American citizens, people in America. And so it would be another a widening of that disconnect between those in power and the populace, if you will. So all of which has really serious implications for the sense of trust in institutions, or the sense that your perspective, your vote, your opinion matters. And there's all sorts of research that shows that people feel very cynical about that, because they'll believe one thing and they don't feel like those in power are listening to them or following up on their agendas. And I would say for most Americans, I would imagine being able to get through the day, have decent pay, dignified work, benefits that can help them live decent lives. Those are all bread and butter center kitchen table issues.
Michelle?
Yeah, so, I would say that in a scenario where we end up with the same administration that we've had for the past 4 years, obviously, communities like mine, like the Black community, the Latinx community, will turn to, our organizations and our houses of faith and ourselves. And so, one of the things that I said in a report that I actually did for your organization, Felicia, when I talked about the issue of the double gap that Black women face, I say one of the things that we can do as Black women, to kind of push back on the fact that we will be underpaid and undercompensated at some point in our working careers. One of the things I strongly suggested is that whenever we are in a position of negotiating, for pay, for benefits, for work, accommodations, always ask for more than you think you should, or more than you've researched, or more than someone has told you that you should. Just ask. I'm not suggesting a lot more, but a little more. This is something that we can do in terms of individual agency when our government might be failing us in areas where we need them to provide assistance and intervention.
Right. Thank you. Yes, I think I've all heard in various ways you, over the course of the evening, talk about power, individual agency, the importance of voice, control, et cetera. And I think that is definitely a theme in addition to the federal policy theme we've heard tonight. Well, I will just close out by making a small comment about the potential politics here, which is that, you've all talked, it's interesting to me that this entire conversation basically has centered on the question of care. And care really is, this is a set of issues that the vast majority of Americans can actually agree on. Whether you are a parent or somebody who is caring for an aging parent and you need good care, or you are a caregiver yourself, and you want to be and deserve to be well compensated, or you are running a business and you want to make sure that your employees can come to work, with as much of their full selves as possible because their children or their parents or their spouses or whatever have good care. This is something that ought to be able to knit together a very strong political coalition. And if that isn't happening, that is indicative of an extreme problem with the distortion of our democratic system. That said, I think it is possible to move past that to better policies and to better work for more Americans. And so with that, I would just like to thank Michelle and Paul and Brigid and Janet and everyone at the Graduate Center and the Stone Center for hosting this conversation this evening. I've enjoyed it, I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone else has too. Thank you so much.